Hello, everyone, and welcome to your latest developer live stream for Company of Heroes 3. My name is John. I'm one of the community managers on the team, and I'm very excited because I've got a couple of our gameplay designers with me today. Some familiar faces if you watched our previous live streams. Let's start with Jason. Can you introduce yourself and tell us what do you do on Company of Heroes?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Jason. I'm the balance lead on Company of Heroes 3. Really excited to start talking to you guys about what we're working on and what we're presenting.
And Marco, who are you? What do you do?
Hey everyone, I'm Marco, one of the gameplay designers on Company Virus 3. You might know me as Marcus239 from Kutu.org or Game Replays, and I'm very glad to be here.
Amazing. So both of you gents were hires right from the community, longtime players. So I know this is always exciting to talk about the game that you're now both working on. Also very exciting, and I want to give a huge shout out to the team here at Relic. We're finally broadcasting from the studio once again in an all new setup. It looks pretty slick. We're still probably working out some of the bugs here and there, but very excited to be in studio to chat with these fine folks. So let us know. Make sure if things are sounding and looking okay, and we can always make some adjustments down the road. But let's kind of get into things. We got a lot to talk about. So before we start, as always, if you want to stay up to date on all things Company of Heroes, you're going to want to follow us on your social platform of choice: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Company of Heroes. You can find our forums at community.companyofheroes.com. And for everything else, just head over to companyofheroes.com. You can join our Discord server at discord.gg/Company of Heroes. And of course, you can follow us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Relic Entertainment, so you can find out when we're going live, just like we are right now. So what are we covering today? Jason, you already teased it. We're going to be covering one of Co3's first balance updates. That's why we have these folks here with us today. We'll be going over some of the sort of high-level decisions behind these changes as we discuss some of the trends and feedback we've been seeing from players. So please ask your questions in the chat, and we will answer what we can. I'm sure we won't get to everything, but because there's a lot to cover. But before we kind of really get into things, one of the things I want to address up front is that we know players want to see and hear more from us. After launch, the community team and myself, we were caught up with reporting and supporting hotfixes and feedback analysis, and that made communication a little bit more difficult with all of you. So we've recently reorganized and are taking steps to be more communicative moving forward. This live stream is one of those first steps, and we hope to offer insights and showcases and discussions with the team more regularly. And you're going to want to stay tuned because after we have this balanced conversation, we're going to be showing you an updated development priorities chart. So our goal is to have a steady cadence of news for you moving forward. So lots of exciting stuff to get to today. First up, question for both of you. Before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of this update, I wanted to do just a bit of a kind of a check-in with both of you to see how things have been going since launch. I know it's been very hectic for the team, but have you had a chance to play much, or are you kind of just like head down in the back-end tools? Jason, are you playing against people that aren't developers?
Yeah, I've managed to sneak in quite a few games. I think I have around 100-ish. But at the start of from launch onwards, I was able to keep up with some of our community members, but now they're giving me a real hard time. Yeah.
Yeah, we can get into that in a little bit. What about you, Marco? Are you playing a bunch, or are you just kind of just work?
Yeah, I'm actually focusing a little bit more on work, and I play a lot our internal builds rather than the main game. But I do play the game at least like weekly. Every
Amazing.
week I do play games.
Yeah, same thing. I've been very busy with work, but I do sneak in matches against real people when I can. So with the game now out, I'm very curious what both of your areas of focus are. What kind of keeps you busy day to day? Jason, again, let's maybe start with you.
Sure.
What's your sort of area of focus right now?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I'm the balance lead, so I'm working very much to try and improve the balance in the game. We'll dive a little bit into what that actually means later, but yeah, a lot of work, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of staring at the game stats, but yeah, a lot of just balance.
Amazing. Marco, what about you? I know Jason's domain is balance, but I know you're kind of focused more on design. Do you want to maybe cover off like what your area of focus is right now?
My area is 360 degrees, so pretty much the entire game. I'm mostly focusing on features, improving existing features and working on new features. which hopefully you'll be hearing about very soon. But sometimes I also like help out with like balance tips here and there.
Amazing. And again, you're both obviously very skilled players, so I imagine you'll have a lot of input on what we're discussing today with our latest balance update, which is coming soon. So, Jason, I know one of the things that you kind of want to talk about. We're going to kind of start like high level before we get into, like I said, the sort of the nuts and bolts. But I know one of the things that you want to talk about was the team's kind of approach to balance in Co3. I'm kind of curious if you can expand on what that approach is and how we're going to go about it, sort of like, or how we have been going about it, and how we want to keep working on that, like moving forward. So, like, what's that approach?
Yeah. So, just before we start, like, I think we've had a few conversations earlier, but this is our first time really talking to the wider community about what we want to do, what our goals for balance are. Now, before I go into them, the team is aware that there is a bit of a distance between where we want to be and where we are right now. The team's working very hard to, close that distance. We want to take an iterative approach where we step in the right direction slowly to get to the point that we want to be. But in terms of what that is, what we're looking to aim for is kind of like 3 or so major goals. One of which is faction and unit diversity. So we want players to be able to use a wide range of different units and different tools, different strategies between battle groups, units, abilities, all that kind of stuff. We really want to see a wide variety of them in all of our different modes. The second kind of point is we want to have flexible build orders this time around. A lot of the time in prior titles, you very much had a paved road in terms of what your golden path to victory was. We want to add in some elements where players are adapting to what each other are building, so that we have a little bit more back and forth on the macro level, not just on the tactical level. And mentioning the tactical level, the third final point is kind of to maintain the tactical integrity of the game. While we are trying to add all of these strategic elements of what you build, what strategies you go for, a very key component of Co is simply using your units to their maximum potential, right? Tactics, so things like proper positioning relative to the environment, using shot blockers, sight blockers, flanking your opponent, right? Range, all that kind of things. Those need to be, those need to retain their importance. And even if you might not have the best strategy, we still want to make sure that skill still matters and wins at the end of the day. So there's a lot to this, as many of you might know. So we're going to work towards this. And we've hit this to different degrees and different modes and different parts in the game right now.
So I'm kind of curious if we can talk about what are some of the big picture. So we talked about approach, but like, what are some of the big picture like design goals for Co3's balance? How does that apply to factions and play styles, build orders, gameplay? Let's maybe start with Marco, and then we can get into Jason's answer. Marco, what's kind of your take on design goals for balance, especially with multiplayer?
Yeah, so the gameplay team has a few pillars that we follow when we are both designing and balancing the game, and 2 of which are particularly important to us right now, especially when it comes down to balance. And they are that strategy should always be dexterity. So we are not a game where APMs matter as much as in other titles. Instead, we want to emphasize the strengths of our games, where positioning your units, using the environment, physics, cover, they really matter a lot. And when we fall short on that, we want to address that. And the other part is that we really want to make a game where diversity and variety of unit is a key component. So we want different strategies to work and to be viable at every level of play. This means, of course, that we need to spend a lot of time to balance different strategies and prevent one to taking over the others. And that's why, as Jason was saying, we need to take an iterative approach. It just won't be a one patch solves every problem.
Right.
It will be more like we need to work with players together to make the balance better and make different strategies work.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. I kind of was thinking about some of the things that you mentioned there about like, strategy sort of beating out like, reflexes and things like tactical gameplay, is and positioning are so some of those like really, really key things that we're focused on. So I know we're really excited to get into patch notes, folks. We're not going to go over patch notes line by line. Sorry to disappoint. Like I said, we're going to kind of cover them at a high level, and then you can see notes soon. TM. So when it comes to player feedback, I know we get that in a number of different ways. My team is trying to capture all of that from forums and social and Discord and videos and live streams and things like that, and then we're kind of reporting back those top issues to you folks and the wider team. Jason, let's start with you on this. I'm kind of curious how you're interpreting a lot of that feedback, or maybe what is it that you're even like hearing from players, or what are you actually seeing? Maybe it's in your matches or in other people's matches. Let's maybe start with some of those pros that we're kind of seeing and some of those trends that we're seeing, and then we can kind of get into some of the cons. So what are like the good things that you're seeing?
Yeah. So there's quite a few different avenues that we've been looking at the game. We've been playing the game a lot, both externally and internally. And we do listen. We might not engage as often for the balance team in particular, but we are listening. We do see a lot of the posts going around, some of the funny ones, some of the not so great ones. We see them all. But like in terms of the state of the game, some of the good parts we're seeing right now is we're really seeing people really start to dive into a lot of the funnier mechanics of what the different factions can do. Some of them are taking what we built and taking them very far and abusing them. So we're seeing a lot of different kinds of builds come out. Not all of them are quite the same level of power or viability, and that's one of the things we want to adjust. A lot of variety. And another cool thing is like in the different modes, so like from 1v1 to 4v4, we're seeing a very different playstyle emerge for all of the different factions.
Right.
One or two factions are playing similarly, but a lot of them have very different strats depending on what mode you're going, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And that's something we want to support.
I know you also said that you were encountering a lot of weird strategies in your own games, and you're like, why am I getting beat by this?
Yeah. I have a few stories of like people doing some really weird stuff and like catching me off guard.
Yeah. What about you, Marco? What are some of the good things that maybe you're seeing from players or from the community?
So I'm definitely seeing the community and players experimenting a lot more. Some of our community content creators are putting out amazing videos about how our mechanics work. Not all of them actually work as in previous games. For example, like how grenades interact with cover. That's the newest one, apparently. So I'm amazed by their capacity to discover, and I'm also like really impressed by their velocity to discover our content. We have a huge game for factions and a lot of units, and I actually expected them to take quite a few months before actually nailing down on which units were the best ones, and instead it took them just weeks.
Yeah.
Both for better and for worse.
For better and for worse, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's maybe talk about some of those things that like maybe we're not super happy with in terms of balance and gameplay. So I know you got a pretty long list, Jason.
In terms of the cons, right? Some ones come to mind in terms of we have some first order strategies that are clearly beating out all of the rest. They're kind of suffocating the room. Everyone is mentioning. I've seen so many memes of like Jaeger spam versus boys spam, right?
Right.
That Uno meme is still in my head. It's so funny. But like so that's an example of a issue because it's killing diversity and it's also kind of a low engagement, low tactics kind of strategy that is beating arguably harder strategies, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of other issues, like we're seeing certain factions have key imbalances. Some ones we'll touch on later is like the Germans early game are a little bit not where we want them to be. The Americans in some of the larger team games, particularly in the mid game, not really cutting it, faltering. So yeah, some of these things we're definitely looking at. We want to change, and we'll talk about some of the changes coming up soon.
Yeah, I'd also want to add that part of the problem with these strategies is that they suffocate other possible viable strategies that are maybe a little bit more complex to use. So for example, with the Boy-City Rifle spam or the Jaeger spam, they are powerful and easy to actually do, and they suffocate other possible and viable strategies. As for example, in the last patch, we have buffed a lot of other units, but we haven't seen them used a lot because those strategies are still too strong.
Gotcha. So I know one of the big things that we're working towards is hitting a good cadence for balance updates. I know this first one kind of maybe took longer than we would have wanted, but I know we want to get to a more regular cadence so that players know when to expect them and so that they're coming more regularly. For this update in particular, Jason, can you maybe talk about some of like the really high level goals for what we wanted to do with this balance update?
So we had a few major goals. The big three being we knew that certain unit classes were just they just weren't very good. They weren't performing well. So the big one we're tackling this patch is team weapons. So particularly heavy machine guns and anti-tank guns. The other class that we know is not quite great, but we've only made more minor adjustments, is the light vehicles. They're kind of a mixed bag right now, so we want to continue to make adjustments. We have some really key faction imbalances, like the ones we mentioned before with the boys, the Jaegers, early game, etc. Again, we'll dive into them a little bit later. And then the final one is like, battle groups, and like
Right.
a lot of the variety. Some battle groups were just not being used, and for good reason. So we're bringing them up to par.
Amazing. So in terms of maybe ancillary goals, I know you had some sort of side objectives for this patch. I know you're kind of talking about like massed infantry, efficacy of anti-tank infantry. I know we'll get into that maybe in a little bit, but like high level, what are some of the thoughts there?
Yeah. So, and to quickly go through like the exercise of how we're looking at things. So from the highest level, I mentioned the three goals of like, unit diversity and like strategic diversity, right? Well, one of the problems was one of our key unit classes, team weapons and machine guns, weren't good. They weren't very powerful for what they wanted to do. So then we're missing like a key component that counters certain strategies. So the big one being just blobbing a bunch of infantry in a big group. If machine guns aren't really viable, then that's one of the main counters to that strategy missing. So when we saw this, this was killing diversity. Like the best strat was just to mass infantry and then shove it against your opponent. So then, one of the first things we looked at is, hey, is their counter working? And the answer was basically no. So we're doing a lot of changes to that class.
Right. So let's get into finally some actual specifics about what we want to cover here. Marco, I know you really want to talk about heavy machine guns and anti-tank guns, so maybe I'll just throw it to you and let you chat for a bit.
Yes, and actually I'll relate that to also our approach to blobs. So the problem with heavy machine guns is that we have, and fighting blobs, is that we have a lot of levers to pull to improve the situation. And for this patch, we decided to actually go with buffing their capacity to suppress units, to ping units, and make them more reliable. Okay.
No, sorry.
To make them more reliable against other units, and also increase their survivability.
Right.
As that was also like a key part of that. But there are other changes to other systems, for example, smoke or forward reinforcements, which we'll touch on later probably, that are not direct changes to the heavy machine guns, but they have an effect on how they perform. So I'm sure that when the patch will drop, players will experience a very different relationship with team weapons. In regards to AT guns instead, we felt like AT guns were too easy to deal with, especially with vehicles. You could just outmaneuver them and they wouldn't be able to keep up. So some of the changes are aimed to make them more responsive when aiming and targeting vehicles.
Okay.
And also we are making them more reliable in hitting the targets and making them, like, especially on maps that have different elevations or obstacles, we are smoothing the experience much more. So I'm really looking forward to see how players will use that.
Yeah, and a no, like a quick note on the anti-tank guns. Like we're for now we're not gonna change how quickly they're getting killed by vehicles. I know that's a hot button topic with some of the community, but right now most of our changes are aimed to make the anti-tank guns much more scary to vehicles, particularly at long range. Because one of the issues in the game right now is that they tend to hit the terrain very often.
Right.
So hopefully with the changes that we put in, this should happen less. It'll still happen. Anti-tank guns won't be perfectly accurate, but they should be significantly more threatening to vehicles at range.
Right. So, and I imagine that's not something like we're not turning anti-tank guns into like sniper rifles, right? I imagine it's something that you'll need like scouting units or like vision provided by like flares or something else to like make the best use of them. Okay, gotcha. So let's maybe chat about some of the things that we're keeping an eye on. Because again, I know these are kind of like hot button issues. We've said that a couple of times.
Yes.
So I know massed infantry, or what we've already called blobbing a number of times, is often
professional term.
the very professional term. It's often an area of concern, right? In most RTS games, especially in Company of Heroes, where we want to focus on unit diversity and we were talking about like tactics and strategy over APM. So how are we addressing this now, and how are we maybe keeping an eye on it and hoping to address it like more in the future?
Yeah. So a few comments on blobs. So blobs have haunted all of the Coast series to various extents for different patches, right? But it is particularly bad right now. But in terms of dealing with blobs, there's the difficulty is there's a lot of different factors that kind of bleed into how much or the efficacy of blobs basically. Like stuff like their counters, stuff like even as gentle as like the way the maps are laid out, to stuff like the time to kill, right? A lot of players probably have noticed from prior games, time to kill in Company of Heroes, particularly at longer ranges, is longer. So it kind of promotes concentrating your force a little bit more than before, which is something we're looking at. And one of the issues with tackling blobs is we definitely see this as a problem. But we're going to have to take multitudes of different steps at different places to reduce how much we're seeing this, because there's a lot of different elements that go into it. And the first one, this patch, again, we're going to be buffing machine guns. We also did a few other changes to some of the Jaegers and the Tommies that kind of reduce how much this is good. For example, a specific change is just we're removing for Tommies, when they're in the open, they no longer receive their veterancy bonus based on fire. They now need to be in cover in order to receive that bonus. That's just one example.
Right. So I think that kind of like segues really nicely into the next thing that we're keeping an eye on, which is forward reinforcement. Because I've encountered this in my games. I'm just like, this is not fun.
We gotta fix.
So let's talk about forward reinforcement and some of the changes that we're maybe making there. Because I feel like maybe in larger team games, this is more of a problem than it is in maybe 1v1s or even 2v2s. But I'm curious on your more professional take on this. Marco, do you have an opinion on this?
Absolutely. So I want to start with saying that like the concept of forward reinforcement is something that has been in the game since the very first company views. We started with static places, the forward HQs. Then we had the Panzer Elite with the half tracks from which you could reinforce. And we got to this game where forward reinforcements are very powerful due to a bunch of reasons. Some of which are quality of life improvements, like auto reinforcing, so that you don't really have to micro this situation. They'll just be reinforced automatically. And the other one is also like other levers we have that are like upkeep, unit cost, reinforcements. So how are we approaching this problem? Because we see that players are having like a too easy time keeping their armies on the field and not retreating them. With the high-level goal that we don't want like blobs to be as powerful as they are,
right.
We are making forward reinforcement take much, much longer when units are out on the field, when they are far from their HQ, and making them take even longer when they are in combat. So that means that players just won't be able to sustain prolonged combat, prolonged fights and still keep up with reinforcements and expect to win the engagement. they would be
Yeah.
forced to go through.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so and we don't want to get rid of the playstyle entirely. We want to reward players who are investing in like logistics to take over like certain parts of the map. But yeah, like right now, you can just reinforce in front of someone, and you would win the fight because you would have more entities, right? So we're making it take slower. So again, if you're outside of your HQ zone, you will reinforce slower. Now, if you're in combat and outside of the zone, you will reinforce even slower than that, to kind of make sure to tone back it, tone it back, basically.
Okay, I mean, I think those are all positive changes, and just watching the chat, I think people are excited about that. So another thing we're keeping an eye on, and I know you already mentioned it, is light vehicles. So what's up with light vehicles right now, and maybe how should they feel after this update?
Yeah. So I did say at the very onset that we know this is another unit class that as a class isn't quite where it needs to be. But we've made a number of changes this patch, and we'll continue to make more changes in the future. Right now, light vehicles suffer from quite a few different problems. Their mobility quite isn't where they want to be. They're being their counters are a little bit overwhelming right now. So anti-tank rifles, Jaegers with the Panzerschrecks, etc. And also their offensive capability isn't quite where they want to be. They also have the problem that anti-tank guns have, where a lot of the time they're shooting the terrain in front of them. Their guns aren't reaching as far as the enemy.
Right.
And this actually has to do with blobbing as well, because in prior games, if you had a blob, even if the light vehicle or the tank guns would miss your target, it would hit another squad because they're all grouped together.
Yeah.
Right now, we're seeing a lot of times it just hits the ground in front of the target. We're going to be adjusting this in the future, so hopefully this will also make light vehicles feel better and also tone blobs down even further. But yeah.
No, that's good. That's good to know. So let's maybe shift focus and actually talk about the factions in a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
At a high level, Jason, can you maybe identify, like, we'll go through these one at a time, but let's maybe talk about for each faction some of the high level problems and potential fixes. So let's maybe start with the British. I've got it right there, the boys' problem. So at a high level, what do you want to do with the British?
Yeah. So the boys are hitting the town too hard. They're everywhere. So we see it. So we're doing a few changes to tone them back. So one specific one, we're toning anti-tank rifle range is now going to be 35 instead of 40. So so vehicles will actually now have room to actually kite weapons, or they'll just have more time to respond to infantry sections rolling up on them. This also has a side effect where they don't really volley at infantry from long range as much as they would before. Another really big change is we're doing very heavy reductions to how the training center works. So one of the problems before is you could spam your beginning infantry, give them a light upgrade, and then through the training center they would kind of become the best infantry in the game, basically.
Yeah.
And that was not intended. That was kind of a whoopsies from us. So that's going to be toned back. So now Tommies are no longer going to be the best infantry unit scaling into the rest of the game. So as a player, you can still spec very heavily into them, and they will give you a good power boost in the early to mid game, but they're not going to be nearly as good in the late game, and you're going to have to rely on other units. And for the other factions can start using their elite infantry or the elite units and really start pushing you back. So hopefully with all of this, we can see a little bit more diversity.
Okay, yeah, no, that's good to hear. So Marco, let's maybe come at this from the design perspective. So I'm kind of curious, how should the British now function with these changes that we've kind of outlined here? Like maybe you can speak to how the British should play, or what some of the big picture design intent with the British has been or continues to be.
Yeah. So at a high level, we do want British to still feel like the easiest faction to approach. When a new player plays the game, if they play British, they will have an easier time learning all the mechanics, learning all the unit roles. So, and in the last patch, we actually did already buff some of the units that are in the roster. So what we expect now is that toning the Boise rifles down and their interaction with Tommies with cover and with the training center, we expect that enemy factions will have more room to respond to that,
right,
and put British more in a problematic situations when they have to find solutions, and B, that you open up the actual roster of other units, especially the mid-game vehicles like the Humber, the Steward, that already have a pretty unique role, and also the elite infantry like guards, like commandos, like Gurkhas, who are already pretty good, but they were completely overshadowed by how easy it was to play with the Tommies and their AT rifle upgrade and the training center upgrade.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good to know. I mean, all of that's like really awesome information, but what I really want to know is what my build order should be now.
Figure it out.
Well, given we are actually also buffing HMGs,
Yeah.
I think that now British players should rely on a bit more on combined arms early game.
Right.
So have a mix of Tommy's, HMGs, and suppers. And also we are actually we fixed the bug with the Dingo, if I recall correctly, where now it actually uses it is granted the training center
yep.
upgrades. So now it's also going to scale a little bit more. But we're also as Jason was mentioning, some of the changes to light vehicles are actually impacting the unique roles of some units. So
Right.
for example, the CWT truck, when you upgrade it, now it can become very good to fight against airplanes. Yeah. So you now have more specific weapons to fight certain threats.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about U.S. forces. It sounds like, Jason, that they're not doing as hot in the mid game as you want them to be. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so USF has faced some systemic issues in the larger games. We built them around an emphasis around mobility, being able to pick your fights, right? But we found that, with the ways our maps work and how players are engaging with the larger modes, it's been really difficult for USF to find what they need.
Right.
So they've just been lackluster. So some changes we're doing is, for example, both the Greyhound and the Chaffee are receiving buffs. The buffs to the machine guns and AT guns will also help them quite a lot. They're also receiving some bonuses to, for example, their techs for ISC. Bars are going to be either cheaper or a little bit faster to build. So a lot of quality of life, just slight increases for the power for this faction. There's probably still quite a little bit more to go in terms of getting the USF to play just right in terms of the team games. So it's going to be an ongoing process for this one, but hopefully these changes should be a healthy step in the right direction.
Okay, so something that we're going to kind of keep an eye on and keep adjusting in the future if need be. Marco, so same question. What's sort of the design intent, or how do we want the USF to be functioning from a design perspective after this patch?
So I think we have all seen that USF have succeeded or are succeeded with more very specific strategies that are not necessarily easy to counter. So some of one of the goal was to make more options viable in the mid game that players could pursue rather than just go this strategy because that's the only way you can use to win. And actually, that specific one is being toned down with some changes to the sniper and the M16 quad half track.
Yep.
So when we approached, for example, the light vehicles, we identified that, for example, the Chaffee was one of the units that was not performing as expected, and we really tried to boost it to a level where we felt more comfortable. And the other one is that we, since Company Heroes 1, we wanted Riflemen to really be a very flexible unit that can scale a lot through upgrades. So, we are making their upgrades a little bit easier to access, while also reducing some of the more negative impact on their abilities. I mentioned the Poured on them. That was really good at suppressing units.
Yep.
We are nerfing that. But to compensate for that nerf, we are also buffing the long and mid-range power of the BARs.
Okay.
No more one rifleman Ramboing against 3 Panzer
Yeah.
Grenadier squads and the like.
Exactly.
Okay, let's maybe move to the Axis factions. So, Jason, it seems like the Wehrmacht are kind of locked into how they have to open their games. I know you were chatting with me beforehand. You were saying it's really inflexible. So what are we doing here to try and address this?
So there are kind of 2 major changes that we wanted to do to the Wehrmacht on this patch. One was to smooth out the early game a little bit. Even though it was kind of survivable, it very much gave the player no agency. It very much was you just had to take whatever your opponent was giving you. So now we're giving the Grenadiers a little bit of an adjustment so that it's easier for you to navigate through the early game. The machine gun buffs again should really help the Wehrmacht out in particular because they have the best machine gun right now. So those changes should smooth out the early game slightly. The other major change is that we want to make the Panzer Grenadier tier a little bit more attractive, and also just all of the alternatives to the Jaegers basically a little bit more attractive.
Yeah.
So things like Panzer Grenadiers, the Stug, the AT gun is also getting the AT gun buffs. So all those units, the Stummel as well for the 251. And then for the Jaegers are getting quite a significant power reduction because we've kind of underestimated how much power players could get out of that unit.
All Jaegers all the time.
Again, that hand of Uno cards is
Yeah.
so funny. That aside, we're doing some quality improvements to, like, for example, the 221 is cheaper now. So yeah.
So same thing, Marco. What do we want the Wehrmacht to look like, kind of moving forward, and like maybe what do we want their early game to look like?
Yeah. So I feel like we definitely want Wehrmacht to be a little bit more flexible. They are the faction that can go, they can skip tiers if they want.
Right.
So they can decide to play a specific strategy. And before they were actually relying too much on Jaegers. So as Jason was saying, with the Jaeger nerf, we also didn't want players to just skip the building and just go straight the tier 3. So we are making the scout card a little bit more interesting. And that's actually what I'm personally looking forward to use. But we're making all the strategic options, more viable. Even the tier 4, we are buffing the tier 4. We are making Stoßtruppen the elite troop that they should be. And also we are making the units that were not really played a lot, like the Brumbar, a little bit more appealing. We have noticed, and this is goes with every faction, that players rely a lot on medium tanks, a little bit too much probably. So we are making other options a little bit more interesting, especially when fighting against infantry.
Okay, that's actually interesting to me. So you're finding that they're not favoring like anti-infantry heavy armor, like the Brumbar and
they just use
the Dozer.
generalists.
Okay, gotcha. Interesting. Okay, so Africa Corps, Jason, this note was yours. You basically said it's all or nothing, right? It's kind of feast or famine with the Africa Corps. So can you maybe explain what you mean by that?
So so we tried a lot of things with the DAC. They are meant to be the most radical faction. And some of it's hit a little bit too well. Basically, their early game is really rough. But if they can get ahead, and particularly in the mid to the later parts of the game, they can just run away with the game super hard. With their armory upgrades and then vehicle spam, they can, if they get ahead of you, oh boy, good luck. And so, we want heavy vehicle play to be a large part of the DAC strategy, but it's a little bit too much right now. So we want to, tone it back. So some of the later armory buffs are getting some nerfs. The way some of the upgrades work are also being rejigged to be a little bit less powerful. This way that, there's a little bit more incentive to round out your army rather than getting a good unit, upgrading it to be better, and then just spamming said unit. That's still going to be a thing, but it should be a little bit less powerful now.
Right. So Marco, like we were just saying, the Africa Corps is either very vulnerable early, or they kind of steamroll the opposition. What do we kind of want the design philosophy to be behind, like how they should be playing?
So I think that especially with Africa Corps, I think the iterative approach is going to be crucial, because we are still figuring out exactly where they what's the good balance for them to feel where you can really commit to something and be either rewarded for that, or if you're punished, you're not punished too hard, and then you lose the game. And that's something that I think we will reach Maybe not immediately, but we are still improving things. Like even just the opening of the faction. How like what are your initial 3-4 units that you build? How quick you can build those. So we are changing that, for example, which is going to affect how like what are the most appealing units you want to build early game, for example, and that's going to affect also how you play your like the rest of the game. Overall, what we want is to find a better balance, and I think we are already going to achieve that. A better balance between producing a new unit or building or getting an upgrade. We don't want players to just focus on massing vehicles, especially certain vehicles, or to get all the upgrades with just one vehicle, and that vehicle just feels like it takes over everything. So one of the changes, for example, is that when you get all your armory upgrades, you would still need one less shot for your vehicles to be killed instead of two. That's pretty massive, right?
So sorry, Jason, did I interrupt you?
No.
Okay. Do we have any final sort of thoughts on what we're doing with factions before we move on to our next section? Jason,
Yeah.
do you want to summarize things for us?
So one last thing is, again, I just want to reiterate, this is a continuous process. We did talk about our goals and where we want to move these factions, and I hope they're aligned with a lot of what the community wants. Now, in terms of are we going to achieve them in one patch, that not really. We're going to work really hard, and we're going to try and get towards that through every patch. And hopefully, as long as we're aligned on the right direction, every patch we will slowly get closer and closer to the goals that we want to hit. So we talked a lot about it, and you'll get to see the exact changes soon. But then hopefully people will understand that hey, we can't solve a problem in one go.
Right. Like we said earlier, this is going to be an iterative process, and then we don't want to like swing the bat too hard one way, and then have to recorrect or kind of dial things back. So I imagine it's going to be like you said, a bit of an iterative process
Not
as we
underdo
kind of.
anything
Yeah,
too much.
in general, we've been a little bit gentle on the changes we did. We don't want to just smash things and then create new problems.
Right.
So there is a possibility that we haven't quite mitigated some of the problems to the degree that some players want, but that means we'll handle it again.
Yep.
And also, if we didn't mention a change or an issue with a faction in this talk or in this patch, that doesn't mean we don't see it or we're not talking about it.
Right,
We've already gone through a lot, and that's just this patch.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of ground we want to cover.
Yeah. So before we get into our next section, I just wanted to address a couple of questions that I'm seeing in the Twitch chat. So just to reemphasize, this update is strictly going to be a balance update. We actually moved it forward because we were thinking about releasing it a little bit later, but we felt what, this is kind of important to get it out as soon as we can. So we're really happy to be getting that out right away. And in terms of features and fixes and adjustments and new content, that's still to come, and we'll talk about that shortly. But let's kind of wrap up our last section here on the patch. Very, very quickly, I know with this update we don't make a ton of major changes to the existing battle groups, but Jason, what's kind of our focus with them right now?
So we rejigged some of the CP. Mostly, we just rejigged CP costs and the order of some of the abilities. For example, Luftwaffe Indian artillery, just to try and even out the playing field for battle groups a little bit more.
Right.
So hopefully, for example, USFF armored and the Wehrmacht mechanized should both feel quite a lot better to use. That their CP costs were a little too high, a little bit too slow. One note I will mention is that this will mean that tech skipping and call-ins are still going to be very prevalent in the game. In some ways, we've increased that. Now we are aware that this is a little bit of a problem right now. It's a little too extreme, but we made the call to not quite address that in this patch. But this is very much something that's on our minds that we've been talking with the community with, and we'll work towards finding a better balance on this later.
You kind of jumped to the third point there already, and I know
oh yeah, sorry.
It's always a spicy multiplayer question about call-ins and tech skipping. I know There's a large segment of our audience that really loves those things, and there are some that are very adamant against them, and it's kind of this balance that we need to strike in terms of how we implement them. But I know they've also been a part of the franchise for since the start. I know our gameplay lead Matt has mentioned this on stream in the past that we want Collins to be a part of the franchise, right? But to your point, Jason, I know you're saying that maybe they're being relied on too heavily. So how are we kind of keeping an eye on those things for the future?
Yeah. Like we are tracking how much they're being used. And also, it's a matter of how much do those strategies outweigh everything else. Again, our most important thing is to first hit diversity across different builds and strategies. So if that means we have a lot of different builds, as long as there's a lot of different builds, that's the first and most important goal. Then we're going to start looking at the proper balance between how much is your battle group really impacting you versus your core faction kind of thing. Right now, one thing I'll mention is that our battle groups are intended to be a very large part of your strategy.
Right.
Most of our best builds are all reliant on battle groups with their things. But sometimes it's a little cheesy, right? We've had run-ins with certain builds just kind of taking over the game with one or two abilities. We don't want that. Again, this will be something we'll be working for a very long time. I think this is going to be a long-term goal for
sure.
This game.
Sorry, Marco, did you have a point there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that overall, we do believe that call-ins, we want to make call-ins still options that every player can experience.
Right.
So even though we might have not reached the perfect balance yet with them, we still want that every player of every skill level can use them and have fun with them. So we will still probably try to smoothen the experience without before doing more radical changes to them, before considering more radical changes to them.
Gotcha.
Things like economic upgrades have been toned down or moved to a lower, a more late game tier. And we are also trying to smoothen some of the very, very early game calling units that right now are being perceived as too strong or too oppressing to the enemy, to your opponents.
Right.
So we are making them a little bit less viable and a little bit more balanced.
Good to know. So let's talk about off maps and planes, because again, I know this is also a spicy conversation. Marco, do you maybe want to address what are some of our goals are there? I know we have some work that's maybe not dropping in this update, but is planned for the future. So can maybe you address that?
Yeah. So in general, at a high level, we do recognize that both off-map and planes are not hitting the mark in terms of consistency and reliability, even from a visual standpoint. They're not quite as punchy and as smooth as they should be, right? They're plane flight plans.
So many.
And they're hard to predict and they're also hard to counter. So what we are focusing on is bigger, more systemic approach to the problem. So this is not something that I can tell you when it's coming. I cannot talk about that right now, but it's more of a systemic thing that we are doing, where we're really trying to think at how do we solve the whole problem? How do we make the whole experience with planes and off-map better? And in that regards, we're asking ourselves, how do we make planes look better and be more reliable, and off-map more reliable, so when the player uses the ability, he can expect a certain outcome in a certain amount of time. And then also for the opposing players, more ways to read what's happening and to react to them. So we always want this sort of play and counterplay, where you don't just press a button and then the enemy is done, but you can always find a way to react to that.
Yeah.
And find a way to get away of the abilities.
Jason, did you have anything you want to talk about with
Well,
off maps?
no, Marco's put it perfectly. But the one thing I'll just mention again is this patch in particular doesn't really dive into
doesn't
off maps
go
and planes. but we're transitioning a little bit, talking about what we want to do in the future.
Yep.
But yeah, like off maps and planes, very much on the docket. Like planes slightly away from planes, but just off maps in general. We know a lot of them are either a little like crazy and way too good. Some of them are like a little bit hard to use, right, or just not worth using. So we're gonna work towards that in the future.
Okay. Jason, did we cover off faction upgrades, or did you have more that you wanted to talk about there?
Oh yeah. So in general terms, like one of the big additions that Code 3 added compared to like the prior titles, well, Code 1 actually had a bit of this, is a lot of heavy faction upgrades. So the support centers for the Americans, the veteran seat for the Germans, the training center, for example. And in general, we haven't quite hit the mark that we wanted to aim for these. Kind of the goals with these were to allow players to customize their builds as they were playing the game, and or to go for some really cool mutations on what your army normally could have done. But some of the time, either these are just way too impactful and taking over a game, or some of them are just not worth getting, period. And to kind of move them into the more situational or like you want to get them, but they won't break the game kind of thing. That'll be an ongoing process, but we are aware that it's not quite where it needs to be.
I would actually add that one of the goals that we want to have is that we want players to use faction upgrades and even tech skipping, not just as an option of their plan before actually playing the game. Like we don't want players to already come up with a plan. We want them to be able to use the upgrades we offer to adapt to certain situations and balance them out in a good way. And I'll bring this as like my experience with Kowan has been a lot like that, where you start with something in mind, but then you adapt along the way based on what your enemy throws at you and what you feel like is best to use. So I think that's a goal that we want to achieve maybe. And it's an ongoing process, of course.
Of course, yes. Fun question I just saw in chat, and I know I've seen this one a bunch, but British tank destroyer when? Without giving anything away, I know there are some concerns about the fact that, like, is the 17 pounder sort of good enough compared to some of the other options that the other factions have? I have seen the 17 pounder do some like pretty wild stuff and like win games, but I'm kind of curious, Jason, what your thoughts are on maybe like late game tank destroyers and late game armor.
Yeah.
That ability though.
We've tried, and we're going to continue to try to get these towed AT into the right place. We know they're not quite where they need to be. Corporate speak aside, like towing them is a struggle, right? Like it's a struggle to get it to the right place, and that's something we're very aware of, and we want to fix this.
Okay.
And in terms of just tank destroyers in general, one of the approaches in this game people probably notice is we don't quite have as long of a range overall. We don't have the 70 range Jackson anymore, like that or the absolute tank destroyers. And did I say 70? I think it's 60. But basically, we don't have screen wide vehicle to vehicle combat because we want players to get up close to each other, use abilities, start brawling each other, take advantage of people's side armor, et cetera, and we want more of that. So. Tank destroyers in general just aren't much of a thing. I know people look at the Hellcat, it's like, what is this? But
yeah,
there's a lot to that, and hopefully,
Yeah. This is more of a design question, and I'll throw it to you, Marco. A really fun one I just saw in the chat was about is there a way to put a more of an emphasis on defensive options like barbed wire, anti-tank traps, sandbags? I know we see a little bit of that, especially in like more competitive games. But what do we want to see there? Because again, it is something that kind of differentiates Company of Heroes from a lot of other strategy games. Is that ability for your units to build those strong defensive things?
So actually, we do have one small update on the barbed wire because we noticed that players were actually very smart in placing sandbags to protect themselves and then barbed wire in front of them to prevent the enemy from using the cover. But the way barbed wire was balanced, it was very easy during combat that it actually got destroyed by small arms. So now we are making it much tougher. so that it's not as easy as it was before to destroy it and then use the enemy cover. Long-term goal, yes, absolutely. Like I wouldn't even say long. Let's say it's on our radar, and to make those defenses much smoother. I think the approach we had with the way you build them resembles a lot more Core 1, where you can build your minuscule portions of defenses rather than the big long chunk of cover. So we definitely want to take a step back and reassess the system and understand how we can make it better. And that goes for both those defenses, especially when we want to smoothen the experience of placing them, and also all the defensive structures like bunkers. We want to make them smooth and balanced as an experience. At the start of the game, I think we can all agree that they were a little bit too strong, especially the German bunkers. And then we toned them down. I think there is room to improve them, and I hope we can share more news about how we want to improve them.
Okay, good to know. So before we kind of wrap up our patch chat, are there any final thoughts on that? Like Jason, do you have any sort of final thoughts on what we want to accomplish with this update and what we're like looking forward to in the future?
Yeah, we're excited to present what we have. Hopefully, this is a meaningful improvement in a lot of ways. But I completely understand that a lot of players probably want more. Please stick with us because, we're gonna work hard towards getting all of these, hitting all of these goals. And one of the things is, again, I just wanted to mention this is an iterative process, and it's not like it's very difficult to go in a straight line from where we are now to hitting the all of the points that we want to do.
Yep.
And I know we've mentioned a lot in this chat, but we are very passionate, right? Both Marco and I, we've played a lot of co-op, so we really want to do this. And we are working hard to do it.
What about you, Marco? Final sort of thoughts on this update and what we want to get done here?
I think it's a good step in the right direction, honestly. As a player, I'm very glad that we're doing this. And I think it's the right approach. And I'm pretty sure that our community would see that we've put a lot of effort into trying to smoothen the experience for every faction.
Yeah.
So it's not like one faction is super nerfed and the other one is super buffed. There's a mix of that. I also would like to thank the community for their patience.
Yeah.
And also let them know that even though we may not be super reactive when we reply or with replies and talking to them in forums, we do read. We take good care of that. We are really interested in their opinion, and we are really working hard to make this game better. So it's even we are always every day working hard to make the game better.
Yeah, and like we mentioned at the top, we're gonna be hoping to have a more regular cadence of communication now that things have kind of hit a steady flow or a steady rhythm after release. Yeah. Things are a little bit less hectic, and we're now kind of in this the game's out there, it's live, and we're going to keep working on it every day. So before we wrap up, folks, I did tease this earlier, and we also wanted to take a couple minutes to show off our updated development priorities list. So we're going to be, let me just switch here so you can take a look at it while I chat about it. So there it is. We're going to be releasing some more information next week on why this list looks the way that it does. Along with what got checked off our last list and how certain items may have shifted around. But for now, we hope this gives you a sense of what we're going to be working on now and what comes next for Company of Heroes 3. We do know there are some big ticket items that players have been asking about that aren't on this list, but we're working hard to get them mapped out and to determine when we can make them happen and to provide more details on them as soon as we can. So I'll leave that up for a couple more seconds. As I do our quick wrap up, again, if you want to stay up to date on everything Company of Heroes 3, and if you want more news on this in the next week or two, follow us on social, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, at Company of Heroes. Join our Discord, discord.gg/Company of Heroes. And follow us right here at twitch.tv/Relic Entertainment, and find the forums, community.companyofheroes.com, and everything else, head over to companyofheroes.com. So yeah, that's exciting stuff. I also want to thank our friends at 511 Tactical for providing the apparel for us today. You can find more of their awesome stuff at 511tactical.com. Jason, Marco, you're both looking good, I gotta say. You're both looking real good. So before we head out here, folks, when do you want to release this?
The $1 million question.
Yeah, like should we just put this out
So I don't
today?
know. Where
Should we
should
just put it out?
No, maybe we should.
We should. I feel like everyone's worked really hard on it now. So
Yeah.
let's say what time is it now? It's
11.
It's 11. Okay. Let everyone go take a break. Go walk your dog. Go have a snack. Patch will drop in 30 minutes along with the notes. So stay tuned. Check Steam, refresh it, and let us know what you think about the balance updates. So have fun in your matches today. And I think we'll catch you next time. Thanks so much, Jason, Marco, for joining me today in our beautiful new studio setup.
That's amazing.
We'll have to do this again soon. So thanks, folks, and we will catch you next time. Until then.
See you.
See you.